As a member of the Task Force on Lyme and Tick-Borne Diseases, I recently had the opportunity to participate in a public hearing in Albany that focused on many of the issues that are associated with Lyme and tick disease. There, my colleagues and I heard from a wide variety of professionals, varying from public health departments, scientists, physicians, advocates, and many patients. This hearing was a great way to start this discussion surrounding these oftentimes debilitating diseases that are making their way through the Finger Lakes region and sweeping across New York State. Just out of curiosity, if you're comfortable raising your hand, how many people in this room have Lyme or tick disease or know someone who has been diagnosed? Wow, that's pretty amazing. Just about, I'd say 90% of the people here. Again, it just shows how important it is that we continue to offer forums like this to increase awareness and education about the issue. So our format for this evening is we will have panelists. They'll each present for about 10 minutes. And following their presentations, we'll follow up with a question and answer period. If you haven't already been given a card, if you'd like to ask a question, I'd like to ask that you please record it on a card. Raise your hand once you have it completed. We'll come around, pick up the cards, or raise your hand if you need a card or a pen or a pencil, and we'll get that to you. I want to take a minute to introduce some key people who are here with me this evening. Representing Assemblyman Brian Kolb's office is Mary Wilmot. Mary, thank you for joining us. Thank you. My team, I want to give a thank you to Jillian Cassow and Caitlin Gilligan, both who are here today from the Legislative Commission on Rural Resources at the Senate. I'm the chair of the commission, and the three of us have worked hard to bring this event to you tonight. If you're interested in learning more about the commission, we do have several of our rural features newsletter that are out in the lobby. Please feel free to pick those up. You can also check out our website or stop and talk to Jill later. Jill is the Director of Rural Resources and Legal Counsel, and Caitlin is our Policy Analyst. So thank you both so much for your help with this event. Also here with me this evening is my Chief of Staff, Chris Catt. Chris, thank you. My Communications Director, Jonathan Monfletto, who's in the back of the room. Out at the desk, checking you in, was Allie Barrow, a Community Affairs Coordinator. And I also have two of my field representatives here this evening, Adeline Rudolph and Slajana Mitras. Thank you all. It was important for me to introduce you to these people because when you call the office, you'll oftentimes reach out to one of these folks. So I wanted you to be able to put a face with a name. Before we begin, I also want to thank Amy Polly. Is Amy still here? Oh, there she is, way in the back. Amy is the development officer at FLCC. She's been excellent in allowing us to use this place, helping us with all the technology, and thank you so much, Amy. I'm very grateful for that. Amy's also a great partner on many other issues related to community colleges and workforce development. I enjoy working with her and look forward to continuing our partnership. Thanks, Amy. As you came in, you passed several organizations that had set up informational tables today. If you didn't have a chance to stop by on your way in, please do on your way out. They have a phenomenal amount of information on Lyme and tick disease. They have, you may have picked up, there's several different versions of the tick removal first aid kits. So please, on your way out, if you haven't already stopped, swing by. I'd like to thank Cornell University. They have one of the information tables out there. Christine Bolinsky from the Wayne County Department of Health, and also Seneca County Department of Public Health for having an informational table here, as well as Mary Beer in the Ontario County Public Health Department. Mary's also a speaker today, so thank you. And without further ado, we'll begin our presentations. Our first speaker this evening is Matt Frye. Dr. Matt Frye is an extension educator with New York State Integrated Pest Management Program at Cornell University. He provides education and conducts research related to pest management in areas where people live, work, learn, and play. Matt received his master's and PhD in entomology from the University of Delaware and previously worked in the pest management industry. Please join me in welcoming Matt.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Senator Helming, for that wonderful introduction and for the opportunity to be here this evening. As you'll see, there's a panel of us tonight. We'll be covering a variety of different topics. My area of expertise is related to the ticks themselves. So I will be speaking about ticks and how all of you can avoid ticks. So we'll be debunking some tick myths. I'm hoping that you will participate with me on this journey. Okay, so to start, the status of ticks in 2017. As we have known from research and surveys that have been conducted across the United States, but particularly here in the Northeast, is that ticks are being found in more places. Okay, there are ticks that are now in the far western portions of New York, where previously we didn't see these abundant tick populations. Tick encounters are occurring at home. They're occurring where people work, at schools, and where people recreate, so out in areas where they are playing sports or where they're out hiking. And because of changes in our climate, we're seeing that there is an earlier and longer tick season. So your exposure to ticks is greater because of this lengthened season. We know that for individuals, prevention is key. If all of us took proactive measures to avoid ticks and to check ourselves for ticks at the end of exposure, our incidence of tick-borne disease would be lower. Unfortunately, it's really easy to forget about taking these practices to mind. Think about flossing. Okay, there's campaigns to floss our teeth every single day, and I would argue that many people don't even know what floss looks like. So when it comes to tick management, I'm going to give you some techniques that hopefully you'll take with you and tell your children and grandchildren and friends and neighbors to do on a daily basis. So please participate. If you get the answer wrong, continue to participate. I'm not going to be mean about it. Identify for me, 1 through 4, the black-legged tick. Any guesses? 2 and 3. I hear 2 votes. Any other guesses? 4? All of them. That is the correct answer. Okay. These are all the black-legged tick, a single species of tick represented by 2 different life stages, or 3 different life stages, excuse me. We have the larva, the very first stage, the nymph, and then the 2 adult stages, the female on the right and the male on the left. Okay? This is the tick, the one and only tick that is capable of transmitting the pathogen that causes Lyme disease. Okay? Only tick species. This tick quests where it looks for a host about 0 to 1.5 feet, so knee height. They stand with their little tarsi out and wait for you to walk by. That is the only way you're going to encounter a tick. They're not going to drop on you from trees. They're not going to jump on you. They're not going to fly into your windows at night. They're going to wait for you to walk through tick habitat. So already we know that if we avoid tick habitat, we have a really good chance of reducing our exposure to ticks. The one thing that I will say in terms of Lyme disease is that number 4 there, the larval stage, is not a risk of transmitting disease. They are not born with the ability to transfer a disease. They have to acquire that pathogen first, which they do from small mammals typically, and transfer to another host. There are a number of tick species that we have to worry about in New York State. We already mentioned the black-legged or deer tick. There's also the Lone Star tick, the American dog tick, and the brown dog tick. Each of these species is capable of transmitting a different set of pathogens, so it's good to know what they look like and what your risk might be when dealing with these different species. Okay, so this is going to be a true or false question. Deer sustain Lyme disease. How many people think true? So let's just say that deer are heavily involved in the disease transmission to people. No. Okay, excellent. This is a very educated crowd. I'm very happy to hear that. This is false. Many people think that the deer are the ones that are sustaining the disease. They're the ones that are contributing to the problem that people have. When in fact, ticks are acquiring pathogens from small mammals, particularly the white-footed mouse. Okay? And these guys, if you can look closely, you can see that there are ticks attached to the ear here and around the eyeball. So this is very common in field trapping, that you'll encounter ticks on the mice themselves. True or false? You can monitor for ticks. True, right? This is a very easy thing. At our booth, the New York State IPM program, you'll see an example of the tick drag that's in the picture on the left. It's a piece of white cloth that you drag behind you. Ticks are out looking for you, and they'll grab onto anything that crosses over them. Once you do that, you can collect them and put them in a vial of alcohol, watch them suffer as they die in that vial, and then you can properly identify the tick that you have. Again, this is important for understanding what species and what your risk of exposure is. Ticks only live in tall grass. Also false. You guys are going to get all my questions right, I have a good feeling. We know that different tick species occupy different tick habitats. On the left is the Lone Star tick, which can occupy any habitat. It can be out in a sunny field or in the dense woods and in between. The black-legged tick, the one that transmits Lyme disease, tends to be in forested areas or in that edge habitat between the field and the forest. And the American dog tick can be and often is found in bright, sunny areas. So it's good to know where we can encounter these different ticks. Okay, hopefully you get this one right. You can protect yourself. You betcha. Okay, there's a number of things that we can do. The first is using some kind of pesticide. This shows a treatment of clothing with a product called permethrin. You can buy permethrin from most sporting goods stores, from big box stores as well. Treat your clothing, and that treatment will last 6 to 7 washes. This product is only available for use on clothing. It is not intended for use on your skin. And the way that it works is it binds to the clothing material, and as a tick or other organism crawls on it, it's exposed to a lethal dose and dies. There's no risk associated with using this for humans. This has been used on clothing for a number of years, as well as camping gear, and has not posed any risk when used according to the label. There are also repellents that you can use. And can anybody think of an example of a repellent? DEET, exactly. So what repellents do is they make you difficult to find for a tick. A tick is going to quest, and as it detects carbon dioxide and other smells that it associates with a mammal, it's going to latch on. But if it doesn't think that you're an animal, then it might not latch on. So we have these repellents such as DEET, picaridin. If the rate is 20 to 30% for DEET and 20% for picaridin, you're going to have about 4 to 5 hours of protection. Lower percentage of these repellents means lower amount of activity time. Okay, so in most cases, you don't need 100% off woods DEET. 20 to 30% will be just fine. Some other products that have been proven to be effective are oil of lemon eucalyptus and IR3535. Another thing that you can do to protect yourself is after exposure to put your clothing that you wore outdoors into the dryer. Desiccation by tumbling and high heat will kill ticks that are on your clothing. Okay. Killing ticks at home, typically with a pesticide, reduces your risk of Lyme disease. What do you think? Hush falls over the crowd. That means you guys aren't sure, which means that it is false. Okay, this one's unfortunate. This is according to a CDC study where they tested individual lawns with pesticide applications. And what they found was that if you spray just your lawn, your risk of encountering ticks may be reduced, but your risk of Lyme disease is not reduced. And the reason for that is you may encounter a tick when you're hiking, when you're gardening, when you're at your neighbor's house, or anywhere else. Just treating an individual lawn isn't enough to reduce your incidence of Lyme disease. Most people can feel a tick crawling on them and then the bite. No, false. Excellent. Okay, so ticks are these cryptic, little tiny predators. Their saliva has anesthetic properties. They are designed to not be detected. Okay, so you're not going to feel them when they bite or crawl on you. Ticks are active spring to fall only. False. Okay, excellent. Ticks may be active whenever temperatures are above freezing, just so you know for your own risk. Running out of time here, but what I wanted to say is that the number one thing that everybody could do is every day to spend 2 minutes checking yourself for ticks. And this means in all those places that we're not supposed to talk about in public. Those warm, moist areas are ideal for ticks. That's where they want to be, okay? And I think this will be addressed, but what do you think? Correct tick removal is better than quick tick removal? Absolutely, okay? So we want to use sharp tweezers, grab close to the skin, and pull. We don't want to burn, suffocate, squeeze, or twist. And with that, I am done, and we'll have our next speaker.
Thank you, Matt. That was very informative. Our next speaker is Dr. Robert Ostrander. Dr. Ostrander is the Associate Professor in the Department of Family Practice at SUNY Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse. He sits on the New York Governor's Rural Health Council and is on the Board of Directors for the New York State Academy of Family Physicians. Dr. Ostrander attended Union College for undergraduate studies and earned his MD from Upstate Medical College in Syracuse. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ostrander. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're setting this up. My recent background in Lyme disease, I was president of the New York State Academy of Family Physicians last year, actually. And because this is such a statewide issue, we've been very involved and very active in this, both from a education standpoint, public policy standpoint, and working with the Department of Health and Legislature. I'm going to focus on issues that we see in the office and working with your physician about tick encounters and Lyme disease. I'm going to start with a 30-second my own story, and that is I was coming home from vacation in the Adirondacks this summer, and on the way home started to feel really crummy. And halfway home, I started having chills and sweats, and it felt exactly like influenza did. And I had 103-degree fevers for several days running without an obvious source. It really wasn't a typical story for Lyme disease given the height of the fevers and things, but because of where we live, we made a presumptive diagnosis and treated for that while we were sorting out other diagnoses. My initial Lyme test was negative, as it often is early in the course of the illness. And we continued to treat for these other diseases as well, but prudently, because it still remained a possibility, checked follow-up Lyme testing at the 4-week mark, and what I had was Lyme disease and not polyarteritis nodosa, which is what we thought I had. So I'm in the recovery phase of that, so I know of what I speak other than just as a physician. So common office phone calls. I found a tick on my son, I took it off, I don't know if I got it all. And that's a common question that we get. If the mouth parts are left behind, it does not pose a significant risk of infection or problem with Lyme disease, because folks often think that they or we should be digging around for mouth parts they left behind, and that happens at times. The body digests those and gets rid of them in a few days. I have a tick under my arm and I don't know how to get it off. Well, hopefully we're going to be learning how to get it off some here, but we very often, if people are, you have to make a decision when folks call whether they sound like they're going to be comfortable with the instructions, but most of them aren't. So we have them come in and remove the tick and then give them a little education on what to watch for. This is probably the most common phone call that we get is I pulled the tick off yesterday and now there's a red rash there. It's important to know that the ECM rash, the rash of Lyme disease, that occurs in roughly 70 to 80% of early Lyme, doesn't appear day 1 or day 2. The redness that you get around a tick bite that often peaks about 24 to 48 hours is an inflammatory response to bug spit. And bug spit causes inflammation, whether it's a mosquito or a Lyme tick. So that's an inflammatory reaction to the Lyme spit. It's not a sign of infection. We always, of course, tell people to watch for not only the ECM rash, the Lyme rash, the erythema chronica migrans rash that may occur. I'm talking about Lyme symptoms, but also signs of infection. Because anytime there's a break in the skin, you can get just a boring garden variety boil, and to watch for that. But that redness is neither a boil nor ECM, and it doesn't need any specific treatment other than to keep the wound clean until it heals. And then the fourth phone call is I think I have a bullseye rash because they've been on the internet or been to a forum and learned about Lyme disease. And those folks need to come in, obviously, and have the rash looked at and decide if it's consistent with ECM or something else. One of the take-home messages from this slide is that most ECM is not bullseye. That's sort of the classic that you see, but most ECM doesn't look like a bullseye. It's a flat pink-red rash, sometimes more red in the center than at the outside, actually. I'm sorry, erythema chronicum migrans, that's the rash that is the early phase of Lyme disease. When you first get Lyme disease and the spirochete, the germ gets into your skin and it starts to multiply, it spreads out under the skin initially and causes a rash. And that is the hallmark of Lyme disease in the roughly 70% of early Lyme disease. Office visits. I took a tick off yesterday doing I need antibiotics. There was one research study done that suggested that if there was an engorged tick removed in an endemic area like this, that if you took a single dose of doxycycline, it would cut down your risk of getting Lyme disease. And there's differences in practice around the area, whether folks do that or not. The evidence was not all that convincing that it cut down the total number of Lyme disease cases and problems any more than having people be very vigilant about the symptoms. Second office visit, I have a rash, could it be Lyme disease? And we just talked about that. The early rash of Lyme disease that happens is no earlier than 3 days before the tick bite, at the site of the tick bite, typically closer between 5 and 15 days after the bite, is a spreading red, pink rash. Sometimes it's paler in the center than at the edge, which is what they meant by bullseye or target rash, but it often is not. So that's the early rash of Lyme disease, and it takes some experience to help folks decide if that's what's going on or not. If it's at the site of the tick bite, it's pretty easy. And if they have that rash in that setting, the diagnosis of Lyme disease should be made and is made. There's no blood test or other test that is that shows anything that early. But if someone has the rash of Lyme disease at a tick bite site at the right time interval, they have Lyme disease and should be treated. The typical treatment for early Lyme disease is 10 to 14 days of doxycycline. I feel like I have the flu, and again, that's an office visit. And if people have fever, body ache, headache, in the right place, especially in the right season, whether or not they know they had a tick on them, whether or not they have the rash, and if they don't have another explanation for those things. And if they have a sore throat, they probably have strep throat, because Lyme disease doesn't usually give you that sort of thing. If they have a respiratory infection, a cough, they probably have a respiratory infection. If they have diarrhea, they probably have an intestinal infection. But if they feel sick all over and there's no one spot, like what I had in Lyme season, they should be treated. But if you don't have the rash to make the diagnosis, a good doctor thinks of other possible explanations, treats for Lyme disease and keeps an open mind, probably does a blood test, which will likely be negative if you're in the first week or two, and then considers repeating that blood test at the 3 to 4 week mark to see if people convert the blood test to positive. And the vast majority of early Lyme disease will do that. We'll have the blood test turn positive at the 3 to 4 week mark, and if people have been treated, that's informational, but then it confirms that it was that and not something else. I'm always achy and tired. My sister thinks I have Lyme disease. This is a big area of controversy, but there's very little in our standard medical scientific literature to think that active Lyme disease is something that drags on like that without one of the other hallmark things like arthritis or meningitis. And you have to cast a very broad net and not jump on the Lyme disease diagnosis with those complaints. Take-home points. These are the things that I hope I touched on. ECM rash doesn't appear for at least 3 days, usually longer, 5 to 14 days. That the diagnosis of early Lyme disease is based on clinical factors and not tests. It's based on the story, being in the right place at the right time with the right symptoms to make the diagnosis early. And if you make that diagnosis, it should be treated. The vast majority of people with Lyme disease, even if they've been treated, will test positive with a standard antibody test. There's a lot of controversy about that, too. There are people touting urine tests and all sorts of stuff. But the vast majority of people with Lyme disease will test positive with standard antibody tests. And my last point is something I tell everybody anytime I give a talk to the public. don't Google stuff or Bing stuff if you've got medical questions, because there's just too many people out there with profits to be made or agendas that make it very hard. Some of them sound pretty reliable, pretty scientific. So there's people out there with agendas that make it real hard to sort out what's good and what's bad. There's almost any time you Google a medical thing, you're going to get a bunch of lawyers who have paid for the top places on the website for various and sundry reasons. And then again, people that are offering all sorts of expensive cures for things. So I like MayoClinic.com. So this is what take-home point. MayoClinic.com doesn't have any commercial bias because they're not sponsored by any drug companies. And they're written at a really nice level for people who want some depth. And it takes you through step by step for each disease. What is this? What should I look for? What should I ask for my doctor? What should I expect at my doctor visit? What are the tests? What are the treatments? So I really like MayoClinic.com if you want a go-to spot for health questions about Lyme disease or anything else for that matter. And I'm out of time because she's going to show me the smiley face. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Ostrander. Just a reminder, if questions are coming to your mind that you'd like to ask later and you need a card or a pen or a pencil, just raise your hand and we'll get one out to you. We have a few people here. Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Mary Beer. Mary has been the Public Health Director of Ontario County since 2008. As director, she has developed programs to combat obesity, hypertension, suicide, and heroin. Before she was appointed to this position, Mary worked as a registered nurse in many different areas of patient care. She holds a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing from Niagara University and a Master's of Public Health from Walden University. Mary truly is a leader in her field, and I can speak to that personally. I had the pleasure of working with Mary for many years as a former supervisor in the town of Canandaigua. Mary is an incredible person who does an incredible job for our community. So please join me in welcoming Mary. Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Nice.
So the role of the local health department in Lyme disease or any disease is to prevent, promote, and protect our community. Public health is constantly monitoring data, investigating, educating on prevention, connecting residents to services, and mobilizing community partnerships. My role today is to share a little bit of information about what's going on in our county and mostly to talk about prevention. And I'll try to, what's neat about this is some of the topic points have been already made, so I can skip through those quickly. Which do I hit? Enter? Okay, so I already talked about that. This is what's currently going on in our county. Since 2007, we started with 3 and then 1, and we believe those cases really came from outside of the county, that we really didn't have it here. But they've been marching across on those little mice all across our state, and they are here, both in testing of ticks in our area and in disease. Now this, to be very clear, represents cases that have been meet the definition defined by CDC. I am quite aware that there are many more cases out there than what this represents. So what you see is last year we had 22 confirmed cases. Year to date we've had 42 confirmed cases, and I'm pretty convinced by the end of the year, not confirmed, but probably we'll have around 200 cases in our county, and the numbers are going to keep going up. And that's why this is a good forum, and we need to get the message out that this needs to be prevented. Okay. Well, I'm not going to talk about the tick because that's been well covered, but I will want to say, and I'm not the microbiologist because I cannot pronounce any of those words, but I will tell you we have Lyme. The other 3 we do not have in our county at this time. We've had no cases. This is the prevalence across our country, and you can see that we're also included. They feed on people and animals, and they do like the temps above freezing. For prevention for people, It's really about avoiding the wooded and bushy areas, walking in centers of trails. I won't go into the DEET and all that, that was covered well. And same points about bathing and the dryer. Prevention for pets is really about talking what is the best for your pet. These are my two little guys. These are toy Australian Shepherds, and if anything happened to them, I don't know what I would do. But if you can see the one with the white face, his fur is so thick, to try and check him is so difficult. And then the other one, he's black, so trying to see it is very difficult as well. So in working with my vet, we did end up vaccinating, and they wear the collar. Tick check. After being outdoors, conduct a full body tick check, and parents should check their children, and don't forget to check your pets. They hitch a ride, clothing, shoes, socks, pants, coats, and day pack, and on your pets. Here's where to look. Inside and behind ears, along your hairline, back of your neck, armpits, groin, legs, and behind your knees, even between your toes. And they do recommend that you take a handheld mirror and check everywhere. I did have a tick myself, didn't feel it. I didn't, fortunately, get Lyme disease, but it was creepy. On your pets, under their collar, under the tail, inside the groin area, around their eyes, inside their ears. And the removal of the tick, we have provided from our county out on our table, and I don't know if we have enough for everyone. I think we do. But this is the recommendations from the CDC on how to remove a tick from a person. And we do have even the tweezers in here, so please help yourself and take one, and the directions are there. Again, don't twist it, pull it up. And the other thing is, if you're too creeped out, you can go to urgent care, or you call your provider or your vet, if it's, for the dog. There we go again. Yeah. So the early symptoms and signs is when you should be calling the doctor. And again, the good doctor talked about the timing. There is that EM rash he talked about, the bullseye rash. If you have fevers, chills, swollen lymph nodes, muscle aches, joint pain, headache, fatigue, rash, the rash could be warm. It's usually not painful, though. So do call your doctor or go to urgent care. The rash, again, here's a bullseye rash, but the second example is an atypical rash. So if you have a rash like this, you really should be seeing the provider. Here's some additional atypical rashes. It's not normal for your body to have these, so call your physician or go to urgent care. Later signs and symptoms, if you haven't been treated, can lead into severe headaches and neck stiffness, rashes, severe joint pain and swelling, facial palsy, pain in tendons, muscle joints and bones, pain, irregular heartbeat, episodes of dizziness or shortness of breath, swelling of the brain and spinal cord, nerve pain, shooting pains, numbness or tingling, short-term memory challenges. So this can be a very debilitating disease. So it really is important to be aware of your body and to be very diligent in your trying to prevent yourself from getting this disease. The other thing I do want to say is if you have more chronic symptoms of chronic Lyme disease, if you are dealing with leftover symptoms for a long time, we do have a program for chronic disease of any kind, and we really recommend that you could tap into that. And you can tap into it by calling any public health department, because all of them are running these programs now. And it's called the Healthy Living Workshop. And participants have found these workshops to be very beneficial. They last about 6 weeks, and they provide you with tools to manage chronic disease or physical or mental condition. The added advantages include meeting peers with similar chronic disease and learning and supporting each other. So those resources are out there. So with that, I think I will turn it over to our next speaker.
Thank you. Just a quick comment, too, on the Healthy Living Workshop. After hearing from so many people impacted by Lyme and tick diseases, what I hear over and over again is sometimes you just need to be able to talk to others who are in a similar situation to you. You need to be validated. You need someone to tell you you're not crazy. These things you're experiencing, they're real. So I encourage you to investigate the Healthy Living Workshop. Our next speaker will be Holly Ahern. Holly is an award-winning professor of microbiology at SUNY Adirondack, where she teaches biology and microbiology. Her current research focuses on developing advanced diagnostic tools and advancing scientific research on Lyme and other tick-borne diseases. Holly also is the co-founder and vice president of the Lyme Action Network, an organization whose mission is to educate people about tick-borne diseases and to advocate for patients who have suffered from tick-borne diseases. Please join me in welcoming Holly.
So good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is a college, and I'm a college professor, so it's only logical that there would be a quiz for you. So as we go through this quiz, I'm going to ask a series of questions, and you get to weigh in, and then we'll just kind of review the answers together. And I just want everybody to realize that the answers that you will see to the quiz are based on the scientific and medical literature, so fully evidence-based, and not Dr. Google. Okay, question number 1. Lyme disease is a very common infectious disease in the United States and occurs everywhere, not just in the Northeast. Is this true? False? So it is presumed to be a disease that's regional, more or less regional in the Northeast, but the reality is it's the second most common infectious disease in the United States out of all infectious diseases. So number 1 is chlamydia with over 1 million new cases. Number 2 is Lyme disease with almost 400,000 new cases per year. And I have to say that number is likely to be higher because that number is based on laboratory testing, which is known to be wrong half the time, falsely negative half the time. So you can probably double that number of cases. So obviously, it's not a regional disease that is transmitted by just one single type of tick that you happen to encounter in a few places on Earth. It is a very common infectious disease. Okay, so a tick bites through your skin and starts to feed. It has to be there and feeding for at least 36 hours before you are at risk of getting a tick-borne disease. Is that true? That was quick, right? So you were right. That is actually false. And although that is the common belief, that is based on one single study that was done a long time ago, the majority of studies that have been done to determine how long it takes ticks to transmit disease have been done with animals and using that immature stage, the so-called NIV stage tick, that teenager tick. And even in those studies, it's been shown that Lyme disease, the bacteria that cause Lyme disease, can be transmitted within 12 hours and certainly within 24 hours. And the other thing that I think is important to add is that it isn't just Lyme disease. There are other tick-borne microbes, should I say them out loud? Babesia, Anaplasma ehrlichia, Bartonella. I know. So those are transmitted in, actually for some of them, we don't know how long it takes for the tick to be attached before the microbes are transmitted. And the new, you've been hearing probably about Powassan virus, which is a virus that may cause encephalitis in some people, not very commonly, but it can be transmitted almost immediately. As soon as that tick is attached and biting, the virus can be transmitted. So I think it's safe to say that no amount of time is really, it's safe to assume that you are at no risk of getting a tick-borne disease, that you actually are. Okay, so this is a review of what Matt had to say. So I hope you get this one all right. So what is the best way to remove a tick? Touch it with the head of a match? Ouch, whoever thought of that idea? Smother it with petroleum jelly, or there was a thing going around this summer about putting peppermint oil on it. I don't know if anybody saw that. Bad idea. Grasping it with tweezers and pulling straight up, or using a tick removal tool, of which Cornell is actually offering you free tools out there if anybody wants to stop and pick them up. And don't pick at it with your fingers, which I know lots of people that actually do that, but you can leave pieces and parts behind, and that's not a good thing. So the answer was C. Grab it, pick it up, and then do what with it? Put it in a vial of alcohol and watch it suffer and die. And then you can send it to Cornell University for testing to find out what pathogens are present in those ticks. So it adds to what we understand about ticks and tick bites, and it also has a purpose for you guys as well. So if you are bitten by a tick and are infected with Lyme disease, you'll know it because a rash that looks like a bullseye usually appears around the bite within a few days. Does anybody think that's true? Because what the science says is that that is false. And unfortunately, that is one piece of information that is very misleading and I think personally very dangerous. Because when you look back at the scientific literature, what the science says is that the erythema migrans rash, or the bullseye rash, which you can see in that lovely CDC picture, occurs less than 10% of the time. So in confirmed cases of Lyme disease, people with confirmed cases actually show up with a bullseye rash. And by bullseye, I mean classic bullseye with, the target sign 10% of the time. Then 40% of the time, there's some kind of a rash, right? Red raised rash around the site. Number 3 over there, the guy's calf. Do you see any kind of rash on that guy's calf? No, because there isn't any. And that is, in fact, 50% of cases of confirmed Lyme never noticed any type of rash. So if I had lots more time, I could explain to you why that actually occurs, but I don't. So just want everybody to understand, don't wait for the bullseye because it may not ever appear. And unfortunately, the body of evidence, the mainstream view of Lyme disease, all of the clinical research of what we understand about what Lyme disease is right now is based on studies done where that bullseye rash was the clinical sign that was used either to include people in the study or was used as a clinical endpoint of those studies. So what we know about Lyme disease is based on 10% of all people who have Lyme disease. That's a big window of people that we really don't know anything about, and that includes long-term illness. So, if you have a blood test for Lyme disease and it comes back negative, you definitely don't have Lyme disease. That is false, because the serological test that we currently use as the gold standard for diagnosing Lyme disease has a very poor sensitivity. What sensitivity means is the rate of true positives. And so it is these tests are very specific. So in other words, if you get a positive test result, it is very likely that you do have Lyme, but a negative test result doesn't mean that you don't. And by valuing specificity over sensitivity, unfortunately, there are many physicians who will believe that a negative test for Lyme disease means that you don't have Lyme disease, and also that there are people that will never develop antibodies or will develop such a weak response that they don't respond in that test. So these tests, since the beginning of Lyme disease history in 1977, even the earliest studies said serology is not a good way to diagnose this test, and yet 40 years later, we're still using the same type of diagnostic test. And so what we're trying to do now is to come up with a direct diagnostic test that will allow physicians and patients to know if they in fact are infected, which people who have the infection would benefit from antibiotic treatment. Those who do not would not benefit. Right now, that is not a definite thing based on these laboratory tests. So if you are bitten by a tick, and you take a 1-day dose of an antibiotic like doxycycline, which means morning and night after your tick bite, that will prevent you from getting Lyme disease. Is that true or false? Okay, so you guys are getting it all right. I don't know how I'm going to give out grades for this because I think everybody's going to get an A. But the answer is, this is false. And there's one single study done. The study was done in 2001. And the study was done in a what I call tail wagging the dog sort of scientific way, where they had already decided what the answer that was they wanted to be, and then they went back and had the data show that. So with that in mind, it is their 1-day dose of doxycycline will not prevent you from getting Lyme disease, and even that study could not conclude that it did, but it just said that Lyme disease is hard to catch and easy to cure, and that became a headline that made it actually all in the New York Times and lots of other places because it was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. That is the one and only study ever done on tick bites in humans where this was ever tested. This study needs to be redone in a way, in an objective way. So, tick-borne diseases are difficult to diagnose and often complicated to treat. That is absolutely true. And I think that even tonight, what we've heard shows that there is still a great deal of confusion about what Lyme disease is, what other tick-borne diseases are, and what we should do about them. So the answer is, yeah, that statement is true. And last but not least, to address and work towards solving issues with Lyme and tick-borne diseases, what do we need? Do we need the CDC to stop basing its recommendations on 30-year-old science? Sorry, that was a little snarky, but. Do we need research to discover more accurate diagnostic tests and effective treatments for tick-borne diseases? Do we need research to discover ways to decrease human exposure to ticks and tick-borne diseases? Yep. Do we need leadership to assure that patients will have the right to the appropriate level of medical care for their tick-borne diseases? So the answer is all of the above. So this is my organization, Lyme Action Network. That is our website. I left information for you out at the table, including a publication that we have distributed to over 40,000 individuals and across the country, actually. And also my Senate testimony that I gave on August 29th, I provided that also for you if you want to stop out at the table on your way out the door. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Holly. There's one more thing I would add to the second to last slide of things we need. You know, what does it take to get all of those things accomplished? It takes funding. And that's one of the things that the New York State Senate is working on. That was one of the reasons why we held the public hearing, is because we understand it's going to take more money to get the research done to help provide answers to people. And I'll have more on that when we wrap up later. Our last speaker this evening is Dr. Cassandra Guarino. Dr. Guarino is the Extension Associate for Serology and Immunology at the New York State Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory, where one of her major responsibilities is to assist veterinarians with the interpretation of Lyme disease diagnostic results. She received her doctorate from Cornell University in comparative biomedical science and continues to perform research towards the development of improved diagnostic, I don't even know that last word, assays, right? I mean, this is why we're here, right? To learn, right? Dr. Guarino, thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, so we've already covered a lot today, and we talked a little bit about animals, but I'd like to talk to you more about your animals and what you can do to protect your animals, because many of our animals, both our livestock and companion animals, are susceptible to tick-borne disease. So I'll start off with prevention. There are numerous products on the market to help prevent ticks from ever getting onto and feeding on your animal. So please speak to your veterinarian and make sure that you keep up on the monthly, or some of the products are actually every 3 months, but keep up on treatment for your animals to prevent them from getting tick bites in the first place. So vector-borne disease, as we've discussed today already, is on the rise. There was a study that was performed back in the early 2000s that was looking at the point of care tests that are available at your veterinarian, for exposure to tick-borne disease. And so this is exposure, seroprevalence, meaning that the animals have produced antibodies, they've been exposed to the bacteria, but not necessarily developed disease. And these are the maps that were produced of the New York State area for these three pathogens, Anaplasma, Ehrlichia, and Borrelia burgdorferi, which causes Lyme disease. And all of these particular bacteria have been mentioned already. This study was then repeated from 2010 to 2012, and you can see by the expansion of those dark colors that there's been a significant spread of these diseases, and that can be detected in our companion animals. As was mentioned earlier by Holly, thank you for that, we are now testing ticks at Cornell University. The Department of Health used to test ticks regularly, and my understanding is they're not doing that anymore. And so as a service to the public, Cornell University is now offering tick testing. There is a cost to this testing. It is $100, and for that fee, you can have up to 6 ticks tested. Those ticks can come off of your animals or off of yourself or your children or your cousins or your friends. If you find ticks, please do send them to us, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. The data I have here is for Tompkins County, New York, which is where Cornell University proper is based, and what we find there is over 30% of our ticks carry Borrelia burgdorferi, the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. So does anybody know what some of the typical symptoms of Lyme disease are in dogs? Lameness is the biggest one. So if your animal is limping and you don't have a particular cause, it's very reasonable to go to the vet and ask the vet to test for Lyme disease. Additionally, they can have fever, they can stop eating, they can be lethargic and depressed, and they may have pain in their joints. And in the worst case scenario, they may end up with renal failure. And this is a terrible situation because often by the time the disease is that far advanced, they are beyond care. In some cases, they can be treated, but it's important to, as I mentioned earlier, prevent the animal from being bit by ticks in the first place. Further symptoms of rickettsial infections, so the Ehrlichia and the Anaplasma are both in the order rickettsial. These are intracellular bacteria. They have similar symptoms, more common with the fever, but they also may have coughing and abdominal pain associated. So a question for you guys, can cats get Lyme disease? So yes and no. The answer is not typically. You can actually experimentally infect a cat and give them Lyme disease, but typically cats do not get Lyme disease. We do occasionally test cats, and on the rare occasion we get positive antibodies, which indicates, again, exposure, not necessarily disease. However, are cats susceptible to other tick-borne diseases? And yes, indeed, they are. One of the examples is mycoplasma. Really important for me to note here is please do not use permethrin on cats. Talk to your veterinarian about products specific for cats. There are certain chemical compounds that cats are very sensitive to, and you don't want to accidentally kill your cat by using an inappropriate product. And that also goes for if you're treating your clothes in the way that Matt described. Make sure you're doing it in an area that is far from your cats, and don't allow your cat's exposure to that clothing. Next question, are horses at risk for Lyme disease? Yes, indeed. Horses are at risk for Lyme disease, and it can actually cause severe debilitating disease in horses. Some of the less debilitating symptoms include reluctance to work. We hear veterinarians being told, my horse is just not acting right, he's lazy. Sometimes they'll actually show stiffness or lameness, and the vet can't find another cause for that. And one interesting clinical sign that hadn't been really seen previously is a sensitivity to touch. And one of my friend's horses actually got this, where her horses were great, they loved to be touched and groomed and cuddled, and one day her horse said, don't touch me. She couldn't even put a brush to him, and it turned out that he was tested and he was indeed positive. Worst case scenario in the horse, they can actually get uveitis, where the bacteria gets into the eye and can cause blindness, or they can develop neurologic disorders where the bacteria gets into the spinal cord and can cause a meningitis type condition. Furthermore, horses are also susceptible to Anaplasma phagocytophilum, previously known as Ehrlichia equi, and that often starts with significant fever, and like an infection with Borrelia burgdorferi would be treated with a long-term course of doxycycline. Are dairy and beef cattle at risk for Lyme disease? The answer is not typically. So it is possible that they may be exposed to the bacteria, but we have tested many cattle and very rarely do we see antibodies to the bacteria. They are, however, at risk for a bacteria in the genus Anaplasma marginale. This is actually transmitted by the American dog tick. Thankfully, we do not see very much of this disease in this state. Occasionally, a farmer may purchase a cow from out of state that tests positive, and then it's a big monitoring situation to make sure that we don't establish this disease in the state because it can be devastating. Some of the symptoms include fever and weakness, anemia, so that they don't transport proper oxygen through their system. They get jaundice, their liver stops functioning correctly, and they get yellow in their eyes, and they may actually become aggressive. Thankfully, as I said, we don't have too much of this in the state. It's rarely seen. But there are many other tick-borne diseases of cattle that are found elsewhere in the United States as well as in other countries. Interestingly, Anaplasma phagocytophilum in Europe can cause significant disease in cattle, but the strain that we have here in the U.S. does not. It's very important that we continue to monitor both the ticks and our animals to verify that we aren't bringing new disease into our state. So another question for you guys. If my dog tests positive for Lyme disease at the clinic, does it mean my dog will always have Lyme disease? No, that is correct. So at Cornell, we offer a serologic test that it's challenging for me to say it, but it is significantly more advanced than the Western blot that we use for humans. It's like the Western blot as we're looking for antibodies to specific proteins, but we actually can produce a quantitative value and give you a number associated with how many antibodies do you have in the system. And with this value, we can actually track treatment success. And so what we ask is that if the animal tests positive, and treatment is then initiated, we ask to have the animal retested in 5 months or so. And at that point, if those antibody values have dropped below 40% of what they were initially, that's an indication that the animal has been cured and cleared the infection. And here's a graph that shows 3 different animals. Animal number 2 here you see did not clear the infection. And again, that doesn't mean the animal might never clear the infection. It's possible the antibiotics were not administered properly, and or the animal may have been reinfected, and an additional course of treatment may be warranted in that case. As I close up here, I'd like to point out again, really important to do tick checks, both on yourself and on your animals. Even in the case of when you use preventions are not 100%. I've gotten many calls from veterinarians saying this animal has been regularly treated with X product and there's no way that they have Lyme disease, but they do. So not every product is going to work 100% of the time, and it's important to do regular tick checks, and if you can, use a fine tick comb over your long-haired dog to help get those ticks up to the surface. As I mentioned, Cornell is now offering tick testing. You could test up to 6 ticks in one submission. We will identify the species and then go on to detect the DNA from the pathogens that can be found in that specific species. As Matt mentioned, there are many different species. They all carry different pathogens. Here's a short list of the pathogens that we identify, and there are more in development. By submitting your ticks, not only do you get all of this very valuable information, but you're also taking part in citizen science, because this material can then be used to look for emerging pathogens that have yet to be identified, as well as monitor presence of disease around our state as well as the country. Important to state, if the tick is positive, it does not mean disease was transmitted. If the tick was negative, that does not mean there wasn't another tick that you didn't find. Okay, and if you get sick before you get these results, go to a doctor. Very important. It is valuable information, but it's important to keep those things in mind. We've already talked about safe tick removal. As was mentioned, we have the scoops out there in the hallway, so please feel free to take one home with you. And that's all I have.
Our goal this evening is to keep the Q&A to 30 minutes. We're shooting for a stop time of just after 8 p.m. So as you complete your card, just raise them up in the air, and one of my staff members will be around to pick it up. Okay. Okay, our first question, is Lyme a reportable disease?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes, it is reported to the State Department, or to the local health department.
Okay. Anyone else have anything? Go ahead, Mary.
Well, we actually get, it comes through our lab surveillance, so we actually get notified and then we do an investigation.
Thank you. Had a Lyme titer test last week, came back negative after 2 tick bites over 2 years. What is this test, and could you have a false reading?
The answer is the testing that is done for Lyme disease is called 2-tier serology. It is the screening test comes first. It's called an ELISA or an IFA. It's a text non-specific antibodies, well, specific antibodies, but generalized. And that test, if you are positive for that test, according to the CDC algorithm for diagnosis of Lyme, if you're positive for the first-tier test, then you get the second-tier test, which is called a Western blot, which is a much more comprehensive look at what types of antibodies, what specific types of antibodies you produce. The key here is that the first-tier test, the ELISA test, has a sensitivity of less than 50%. So you have to pass the first test before you get the more sensitive Western blot, and half the time you don't get a positive test result with the ELISA test.
So I'm going to share a different thought about that, because that 50% number is debatable at best, because in order to come up with a number like 50% for a test, you have to know what the actual number is, and if you don't have a test that can detect it, you can't say you're missing 50% because there's no way to detect the ones that they're saying you're missing. So it's a tough nut to crack for sure. For people that have typical Lyme symptoms, typical response to treatment, and in certain research settings where they're able to detect the spirochete and it is causing inflammation, other research suggests that it's in the neighborhood of 80 to 90% positive if you wait 4 weeks after tick bite. Now the antibody levels drop, especially if you've been treated, and that's another, and with time, so that's another difficult conundrum. So if you're not tested at the right window, the sensitivity drops.
And I'd just like to add, too, that that is based on the research studies that all of that was based on are done on people with a bullseye rash, either to be included in the study or as an endpoint. So without the bullseye rash, then that rate goes down significantly.
Okay, our next question is, why is New York State restricting full Lyme panels by IGeneX?
IGeneX.
What is it?
IGeneX.
IGeneX.
New York State doesn't actually restrict testing with the IGeneX lab. IGeneX is a laboratory that is New York State certified for laboratory testing, and that is like the highest standard in the country for laboratory testing. So IGeneX is a CLIA certified and New York State certified laboratory. What is part of the problem, I think, or part of the misconception, is that they do not bill your insurance company. So a physician that orders that test would have to bill you. So in other words, they would take responsibility for billing you directly. And then it is possible to submit for reimbursement from your insurance company. And I know that because that's exactly what we did when we had that test done with my daughter. So the physician will draw blood and send it off to the laboratory, but you have to pay for it at the time the test is done. That all said, it is a CLIA certified, New York State certified laboratory, and if they were not doing the test properly, they would not get New York State certification. So there are some tests that are not permitted in New York State because they don't pass the level, the standard that New York State requires, and one of those is a test called PCR, but most of the other types of tests are available in New York State. It doesn't follow the norm of how laboratory testing is done, and so that causes problems.
Okay. Dr. Ostrander, did you have?
Well, I don't have much insight into, I mean, obviously it's allowed in New York State, and the fact that a lab is certified by CLIA and by the state doesn't mean that that specific test has been FDA approved for its indication. And there are a couple different levels of FDA approval for lab tests. I don't have the criteria right off the top of my head, but that often becomes the issue with whether insurance companies are going to pay for things, and it becomes a case-by-case issue. I mean, there are lots of experimental tests and experimental treatments and partially vetted tested treatments for all sorts of diseases, and it's just not feasible to give a blank check for all those kind of things when they first come out. And I'm not as certain that the specific test was approved by the state of New York, just that the laboratory is approved as a certified lab.
No, I think
Okay.
you're referring to serology, which is FDA cleared. In fact, serology is the only FDA cleared. There are zero FDA approved tests for Lyme disease. So the serology that I just mentioned is FDA cleared. So, and that's the test that IGeneX offers. So,
Okay, so I just want to point out that one of the things that I did when assembling a panel was try and get folks who may have differing views, because I wanted to present you with as much information as possible to let you make up your own mind and to let you investigate both sides of an issue. The next question is, why is the more sensitive Lyme test for animals not available for humans? Maybe our experts from Cornell can tackle that one.
So that really, the biggest challenge there is obtaining the appropriate sample set to do the approvals required. And it has been many years that the Western blot has been accepted, and we are working to improve the serologic diagnosis. And as Holly mentioned, serology in general has its limitations because, as Dr. Ostrander mentioned as well, you still have to catch it within a given window. It takes time for antibodies to develop, and if that bacteria is in hiding, those antibodies are going to wane. And so you really still have to get a clear window. And why it's not available yet, it's just because the research hasn't been done yet, and we are working on it.
Thank you. Do sheep and goats get Lyme disease?
Not typically. Like, we have tested goats, and indeed, I mean, this year, just off the top of my head, I want to say we've tested about a dozen goats. So we don't get very many goat samples in, and of those dozen goats, maybe we've seen 3 that have positive serology. Likely the reason they're submitted to us many times is because the animal is symptomatic. And so I say not typically, but it's not off the table. It is possible. And so if you have a sheep or a goat that is demonstrating signs of lameness and lethargy, it may be reasonable to request the test that we offer at Cornell. It's not officially approved for those species, but we can run it with some species-specific antibodies.
And what about chickens?
That is a very good question. There is some evidence that I've heard of birds being able to carry the bacteria and potentially be a host for then transmitting that bacteria to ticks that bite them. But to my knowledge, we have not seen chickens that have symptoms that would be typical of Lyme disease.
Thank you. The next question begins with a little explanation. We live in the town of Canandaigua off Westlake Road, 1 mile up from Parish Street. We have 6 to 8 deer in our yard every day, as close as the front door. They lie in the grass and graze. Our concern is ticks in our yard, not only for me and my husband, also for our grandchildren who like to romp and roll in the grass. What is our danger to ticks? Do the ticks jump off the deer? And this is a question that my office gets on a regular basis. So thank you to whoever asked it.
I will take that question. So the thing about deer, and I made the point earlier that we try not to call the black-legged tick the deer tick because we're trying not to associate, there I am, okay, associate the pathogens with the deer. The studies that have been completed to date have not shown a direct correlation with the populations of deer and Lyme disease transmission. But we know that for every deer, they can produce about 500,000 ticks per year. So deer are the primary reproductive host of most tick species. So for addressing deer on a private property and addressing ticks on a private property, of course, fencing, of course, managed hunts are possibilities. There's current research taking place right now at the Carey Institute in Millbrook, New York, where they are looking at large-scale treatments of yards as well as treating the rodents. And the hope is that this large-scale effort on a community basis will reduce not only the incidence of tick-borne disease, but also the number of ticks. So right now, we don't have any great suggestions about managing tick populations by addressing deer. But hopefully that information will be forthcoming. So not a very satisfactory answer, but it's good knowing that there is ongoing research to address that question.
Thank you. How do you get young children under 5 years old tested? Can Lyme be transferred by breastfeeding? And what is the best website to stay abreast of developments? And that last question, that's a really great one because it seems like the information is constantly changing as we learn more. I know that is one of the priorities of the Senate task force is to get out the most current, reliable information to the public as soon as possible. I know myself, I've done 2 revisions. If you received my brochure, this is the second revision in I think just 6 months because we put out the first one, got it out to everyone, and got information back that some of the information had been updated and changed. So that is great if anyone has recommendations on the best website to stay abreast. And the Senate Task Force, we do have a website, lymeactioncenter.com. But if anyone else has recommendations on websites.
Well, we do have in the House the chairperson of the Regional Breastfeeding Coalition who might be able to shed some light. Christy? She's looking at it.
Okay. While she looks that up, how about the question, how do you get young children under 5 years old tested? Dr. Ostrander, do you have a...
I'm not sure why it's a question. I mean, you test, the blood work is done on under 5-year-old people just like it's done on anybody else. I mean, a lot of the cases, the early cases that we were seeing, I mean, that's in fact how Lyme got its name in the first cases were a bunch of kids with Lyme with arthritis that clustered in around Lyme, Connecticut, and they were again found to have this spirochete, which was new, and that was eventually found in the tick. So they have an immune response like the rest of us have, and can be tested that way. It depends on. I mean, their exposure tends to be less than school-age kids. That's really one of the biggest groups. Is school-age kids get this disease and can present later with arthritis from it. But children are immunocompetent from 2 on, and honestly younger than that. But you don't see too many kids under 2 with it. I don't have an answer out of the top of my head for the breastfeeding question, but in general, things that don't appear to be transmissible to the unborn child are usually not transmissible by breastfeeding either, and they haven't been able. There's been some question as to whether Lyme disease could be transmissible during pregnancy, but the preponderance of evidence suggests that it is not.
Was there a response? Chrissy, do you want us to go? Okay,
Sorry, what was that?
thank you. If you have Lyme disease and are given the drug Humira, what will it do to you?
I mean, if you have active Lyme disease, I mean, it's an immunosuppressive drug, and you have active Lyme disease, it can make the Lyme disease more severe and more atypical. It's certainly not recommended that immunosuppressives be used in people that are actively infected, and the treatment of Lyme disease in somebody who's immunosuppressed at the time they catch it really should be handled by infectious disease specialist in conjunction with the person prescribing the Humira for whatever purpose. I mean, most of the time, for most diseases with these immunosuppressive drugs that are used for autoimmune diseases, if you all know what, I mean, everybody sees enough TV, they probably know what Humira is. I mean, it's an immunosuppressive drug that's used to treat rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, and a bunch of other autoimmune diseases. Most of those things can be withheld for a period of time. The disease activity may increase, so it's a significant risk.
Okay. The next question. I have several bullseye areas. A PA saw them and suggested blood test. Result was negative. Should I go back to the doctor before I have other symptoms? Hell yes. I mean, does a medical official want to answer that question? I don't know.
I mean, if you're uncomfortable, I mean, if they just, if the suggestion was blood tests because of a rash, that they weren't certain was the Lyme rash, then you should see a dermatologist or someone who can make sure it's the right rash. The problem is there are a lot of other things that cause ring-like rashes, and as we mentioned, the vast majority of rashes from Lyme disease aren't bullseye shaped, but there are a bunch of other rashes. There's some drug allergies, so there's something called Stevens-Johnson syndrome, and there's something called erythema multiforme, which is an allergic reaction to certain medications. There are several other ring-like rashes, and ordering a blood test for a ring-like rash, either a rash is highly suspicious for Lyme disease and should be treated, or it's not highly suspicious for Lyme disease. In addition to Lyme testing, some other diagnoses should have been proposed. I don't think this is Lyme disease. I think it's erythema multiforme or granuloma annularia. I'm throwing a lot of medical words out there, but my advice would be to see somebody who's got expertise in rashes, a dermatologist, for a really good primary care doctor who knows rashes.
Okay. Holly or Mary, anyone else want to comment? What was that?
Agree. It's like treated or
Go back.
passed down.
Okay. Is the information on the Cornell posters, I think this, are the Cornell posters available for free? Yeah.
The posters that are posted on the board are for display,
Okay.
but there are handouts available, including information on the tick testing that we offer, as well as the Lyme disease test, serologic test that we offer for dogs and horses.
And whoever asked this question, if it would be helpful to you, I'm happy to have one of my staff go over and take a photo, and we can mail that to you so you have all that information. Does the state have public information packets available for municipalities to have available for their residents?
They do. It comes in sparingly because they run out because they're distributing it throughout the state. But we do order the pieces in here came from the state free of charge, but they do run out periodically, so we have to just keep ordering until they get resupplied.
So of the $400,000 that was in the New York State budget last year for Lyme and tick disease, $200,000 went to Cornell cooperatives for the dissemination of information, and I believe that's money is used to do things like put together the tick removal kits and brochures, etc. Like I said earlier, we need more funding. We need more money put into the state budget to help address this issue. Will the New York State Department of Health have more information printed soon, i.e. tick ID cards? They're only available in lots of 50. These are the most popular info that people take. I think that's the same.
That's the same.
response.
We do have them in our tick. We do have that card in the tick kit.
I would like to add to that also. The $200,000 is coming to the New York State IPM program. Excuse me. And we are planning an educational campaign to increase the awareness of ticks and tick-borne disease, especially in children aged 5 to 9, which have the greatest incidence of Lyme disease in particular. And all the resources that are created through our program will be available for free download from our site. We're hoping to create tick identification cards that will be able to download and put onto specific card stock. So if you go to Staples, you buy the correct card size, you can print them yourself and they'll be available. So we're hoping to make it very visual, very aesthetically pleasing, and also practical for children aged 5 to 9.
Thank you. What is being done in New York State to educate doctors on the diagnosis and treatment of Lyme disease, particularly chronic Lyme? Who would like to?
Do you want to?
Well, I mean, the whole notion that chronic Lyme disease is a chronic infection is not accepted by most infectious disease folks and practicing physicians. Now, there probably is a post-treatment Lyme syndrome, although it overlaps with a lot of other things. But the notion that people are persistently infected with the spirochete is difficult to prove, and despite comments by others that the research is 30 years old and based only on people with target lesions, it's just not the case. I mean, there's much more recent studies where folks have tried to retrieve live spirochetes, and they're harder than anything to culture, and that's always the reason. Well, you just can't culture them, they're really there, but how do you know they're really there if you can't culture them becomes the argument that goes back and forth between, if you will, the two camps. But there have been a lot of recent research trying to find live spirochetes in folks who have these chronic post-treatment Lyme symptoms, and they have not been found. And furthermore, the outcomes with chronic long-term antibiotic treatment hasn't changed the course of that disease when it's done in a rigorous scientific way, where you do like we do in science and match treated people with placebo-treated people to see if their clinical course changes, and it just doesn't change. So the first thing that's being done to educate doctors about chronic Lyme disease is to educate them that there's no good evidence that a chronic infection exists.
Holly?
So, yeah, if I could speak to that for a second. 2 years ago, the NIH researchers did a study it's called xenodiagnosis, where this is the creepiest study ever, but there were volunteers who had chronic Lyme disease who volunteered to have a tick placed on them under bandages and allowed it to feed completely, and then they removed the ticks and crushed up the ticks and looked for evidence of the bacteria inside the ticks. So there were 10 people who actually volunteered for that, and believe it or not, they're doing round 2 of that, and if anybody wants to volunteer, I'll send you to the site, the NIH site, where they are recruiting volunteers for that study. But anyway, so the results of that were, of the 10 people that had ticks placed on them, which were allowed to feed, the ticks were crushed. They looked for DNA from Borrelia burgdorferi, and they only looked for one of the Borrelia species. 3 out of 10 of them had Borrelia burgdorferi. The tick picked up bacteria from 3 out of 10 of those people. That's 30%. So that is evidence that there are bacteria, at least in some of those people, that have persisting symptoms. I think, and now, like I said, they're doing phase 2 of that, and there's abundant evidence to indicate that these bacteria are not average bacteria. We can talk about that from a veterinary perspective. I was just at a scientific conference over the weekend where I was listening to a researcher at Tulane University who works with non-human primates. These are monkeys, as close as models as you can get to humans, who concluded at the end of her study that monkeys can be persistently infected, leading to chronic disease in those animals. And how they know that is because, and this is very unfortunate, but on the veterinary side of things, on the human side of things, there are rules. You can't infect people with bacteria and then watch them and kill them and study their organs after, or at least, I'm pretty sure that's true. So, but on the animal side of things, you can do that. And on the animal side of on the animal studies, what they show is when they do autopsy those animals, that they find spirochetes by several different methods. So spirochetes is the sort of microbiological name for these bacteria. These are remarkable bacteria. They break all of the rules of microbiology, of microbiological medicine that we have ever understood. It's not just Borrelia, it's the others as well, all the ones that have those complicated names that nobody really wants to hear me repeat. So I think what is fair to say is that there is not enough research to conclude one way or the other what's going on with patients who remain sick after being diagnosed or undiagnosed with Lyme disease, because this post-treatment thing, there's a whole group of patients who are undiagnosed and go months to years before being diagnosed, and then the treatment there's varying rates of effectiveness. So it's not just post-treatment people who remain sick, it's also those who are undiagnosed, allowing the bacteria time to disseminate, and nobody knows what happens after that. So there needs to be better studies done. There have only been 4 clinical double-blind placebo studies on this, and we could debate that back and forth, I think, 100 times, but we're not going to do that. So we need more research, I think, and what we need at the end of all that is a way to determine if those people are actually infected. Serology is not the way to do that.
So that xenodiagnosis study was actually widely criticized because the PCR DNA they found in at least 2 of those 3 patients' ticks was the same strains that were found in controls in the labs, and there was a fairly high suspicion among some people who reviewed that study that this was contaminant DNA. PCR will pick up tiny amounts of DNA, and it's easy to cross-contaminate things. I mean, we find DNA from 11,000-year-old Neanderthals. So, DNA doesn't mean there was a living creature there. And again, the strains they found were strains that were in that lab being used as controls. So there was a lot of criticism of that study from people that reviewed it, and so many of us were not convinced.
Okay. Question. So, you're bit by a tick. You don't have a rash or any signs, but you start to feel just not right. You're a healthy person who doesn't have any medical issues, but you found a tick. You don't have the rash. You don't have any other physical signs that you can see or tell. I would recommend you go to the doctor, or I would, in my case, go to the doctor. You go to the doctor, and what can you expect, or what should you expect? And then if the doctor runs the test and it comes back negative, as a person, do you advocate for yourself for the antibiotic treatment? And then you get into the question, how long is that course of treatment? I've heard 10 days, I've heard 14 days, I've heard 28 days. And then do you wait to start the course of treatment for 3 to 4 weeks when you could do that second test that's more likely to come back positive? I mean, how about some advice for the average person who doesn't have a medical background or isn't all that familiar with Lyme and tick disease?
So, I mean, my advice is go to the doctor, and if you're in a tick endemic area like this one, and you have unexplained flu-like symptoms without a source, one would expect to be treated, not wait for the test for the treatment. If there's not another explanation, what we don't want to do is give doxycycline to everybody with a strep throat who feels exactly the same way without making sure that we've looked for their strep throat or their pneumonia, because that's catastrophic. And honestly, that's a lot of problems we're running into with this current Lyme environment, is people are jumping to that diagnosis, and a lot of people are not getting the correct diagnosis because people are so focused on Lyme disease. But in any case, if that's the case, that's what should happen. If you're not comfortable with it, there's nothing wrong with getting a second opinion, period. I mean, whether it's this or anything else. I mean, I certainly encourage any patients of mine or anyone else's that's not comfortable with what the advice they got to get a second opinion from
I think what
someone
I've
else.
heard from people is sometimes when they go for that second opinion, that they're almost chastised by the person they're going to for that second opinion. You've already had the test done, it's already come back negative.
Well, I mean, you shouldn't hunt around for a doctor that gives you the answer you want. You should hunt around for the doctor that gives you the right diagnosis.
And I am not a medical person. I have no background. I'm a person who rarely ever goes to the doctor. But everything to me seems to boil down to the benefit versus the risk. And for me personally, like after listening to these types of forums, after listening to the testimony that I heard in Albany, if it were me, and based on seeing people who are impacted by suspected Lyme and what they're going through, you better believe I'd be pushing hard for that 28-day cycle of the antibiotic. Because what I've seen from people that I know, and even people I don't know, is when you have Lyme disease, it is not a pretty disease. It seems to be that there's not enough information that's out there and available for people. I mean, sometimes you tell someone you have Lyme disease and they act like, you see them 2 weeks later, hey, you feeling better now? Like it's something that you're just going to get over quickly, and I'm not sure that's Sorry, Dr. Ostrander.
I had it, I
But
took 10 days, you know, it's not, I'm not only speaking for,
Yeah. Okay, we're gonna,
right.
I did receive several questions asking about a vaccine for humans. Can anyone comment on, is there research being done in that area? Are we getting close? Does anyone have any ideas?
I'm sorry.
A vaccine for humans.
So there is research on a human vaccine that is in phase 2 or 3 trials in Europe at the moment, which is essentially the same overall vaccine as they developed 20 years ago, which had various limitations, and so they are working on that. The vaccine will be specific for one species of one bacteria, so it's not going to protect anybody from all tick-borne diseases, but and I haven't looked at the data as to how effective overall for Borrelia burgdorferi the vaccine would be. At Massachusetts General Hospital, there's a laboratory there where they're working on something that is very interesting, which is an antibody, a monoclonal antibody, that is very similar to the treatment that they're using for HIV, the preventative treatment called PrEP for HIV, to prevent infection with the virus. And so they've done the same thing for Borrelia burgdorferi, again, the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. And those first line results also look very promising, and they just developed a phase 2 antibody that's even, according to the researchers that are doing this, of course, it's even better than the first generation of those. So all of that has to go through a long course of clinical trials, right? Stage 1, 2, 3 clinical trials. And I know that the FDA is trying to fast track that because of the high incidence of Lyme disease, because again, it's not just Lyme disease, there are other infections you can get from ticks, but they are trying to fast track that because they realize that it's a significant public health problem at the federal level even, so that's what I can tell you about vaccines.
Okay. With that, we're just after 8 o'clock, and I know that I've committed to many of you, we'd wrap up by 8 o'clock. So I'm going to end the questions and answer at this period. However, I invite you to stay around, and I'm sure our panelists will spend a few minutes with you answering your questions or talking about your concerns. But ladies and gentlemen, can we have a round of applause for our panelists? They did an amazing job. And I also want to thank all of you again for attending this informational seminar. Again, tonight, the purpose of tonight was to just bring awareness and more education to highlight this disease. And I want you to know that for me, this is just the first chapter in a long book. I know there are many more questions that are out there, and as the senator for the 54th District, I will continue to work hard to bring additional funding sources to this issue, increase awareness of tick and Lyme disease, and also to accelerate research and provide more comprehensive guidance to our medical community. They're on the front lines of identifying, treating these often devastating diseases, and however the state senate can be of assistance with that, we're happy to do so. So again, I just want to say thank you to our distinguished panelists, and again, thank you to all of you who are attending. Please feel free to stick around. Thank you so much.